He was the kind of actor who could slip into the skin of a vampire, a war criminal, or a charming aristocrat, and make you believe every second of it. On screen, Ferdy Mayne carried an air of danger veiled in elegance, a mystery that made him unforgettable in films like The Fearless Vampire Killers. But behind the signature smile and deep aristocratic voice lay the story of a man marked by war, exile, secrets, and a life spent reinventing himself. Few knew the painful truth that before Hollywood ever called his name, he had already escaped Nazi Germany, worked for British intelligence during World War II, and lived with the burden of a family torn apart by persecution. Ferdy Mayne didn't just act in shadows, he lived in them. And while audiences remember him best as the immortal Count von Krolock, few ever asked, what ghosts haunted the man behind the fangs? This is the untold story of Ferdy Mayne, a man who wore masks on screen, but carried deeper ones in real life.
He was born Ferdinand Philipp Meyer Horkel on March 11, 1916 in Mainz, Germany, into a world that would soon turn upside down. His father, a successful judge of Jewish descent, and his mother, a cultured woman of distinction, raised him in an environment steeped in education, refinement, and music. The Mayers were a family of status and stability until the slow, deliberate march of fascism began to strangle Germany. In the 1930s, as the Nazi regime tightened its grip, Ferdy's world grew smaller, colder, more dangerous. His Jewish heritage placed him and his family in peril, and as anti-Semitic laws grew harsher, the question was no longer if they would leave, but how. He was barely a teenager when his life changed forever. His parents, desperate to save him, arranged for Ferdy to be sent to Britain, where he would live with relatives in London. He arrived as a refugee, young, displaced, and cut off from everything familiar. The trauma of exile would follow him for life. And yet, in the unfamiliar streets of London, something unexpected stirred within him, a fascination with voices, faces, characters. Alone in a foreign land, he began to observe people, how they walked, spoke, held their fears behind their eyes. The theater became his refuge, and English, though not his mother tongue, became the language of his rebirth. He began to train as an actor, developing a voice so rich and commanding that few would suspect he was not born British. There was elegance in the way he moved, a cultivated gravitas that masked his pain. But his early performances weren't just driven by ambition, they were driven by the need to survive, to become someone new, to hide the broken pieces behind the stage lights. While other boys dreamed of fame or fortune, Ferdy dreamed of transformation. Acting wasn't a choice, it was an escape route.
Ferdy Mayne's rise to prominence was not meteoric, it was gradual, deliberate, shaped by decades of resilience, talent, and transformation. By the 1940s, having fully embraced the English language and polished his diction to near perfection, he became a natural fit for a specific type of role, the aristocrat, the diplomat, the enigmatic gentleman. But in truth, behind those roles lay something far more personal, an immigrant turned chameleon, surviving by blending in. During World War II, he served not just as an actor, but as a silent soldier. Working for British intelligence, Ferdy used his fluent German in psychological operations and counterintelligence. While others fired weapons, he wielded language as his weapon, a tool for resistance, misinformation, and subversion against the Nazi regime that had destroyed his homeland. In a cruel irony, the war made him both a man without a country and a man invaluable to one. After the war, his true professional ascent began. The British film and television industry welcomed him as a character actor with undeniable presence. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, he appeared in dozens of films, mastering the art of subtle menace, of restrained elegance. His face became familiar, not as a leading man, but as the kind of figure you couldn't look away from: the Count, the Baron, the suspicious doctor, the scheming officer. Then came 1967, and with it, the role that would etch him into cult cinema history forever: Count von Krolock in The Fearless Vampire Killers, directed by Roman Polanski. Cloaked in velvet, voice dripping with menace and seduction, Mayne's portrayal was both terrifying and oddly tragic. He wasn't just a vampire, he was the embodiment of a cursed soul, elegant and eternal, longing and lost. The film became a European cult classic, and so did he. For many fans of Gothic horror, that single performance made Ferdy Mayne unforgettable. Offers followed: television roles, international films, even comedies. He had mastered the art of playing men with secrets, men who lived double lives. It wasn't an act, it was an echo of his own truth. In Hollywood, where reinvention is currency, Ferdy Mayne became rich with roles. His face graced screens in Where Eagles Dare, Tripwire, Haunted Honeymoon, Conan the Destroyer, and countless TV episodes. Always in demand, always compelling. He never became a household name, but in every scene he touched, he left something behind: a chill, a question, a mystery.
Ferdy Mayne was never the kind of man who craved fame for its own sake. He sought transformation, not attention. But as the years passed, even the most refined masks began to crack. In the 1980s and early 90s, while his screen presence remained dignified and composed, something unseen began to change. Age, that silent force, crept in, not with a crash, but with a whisper. The roles grew smaller, less nuanced, the scripts less challenging. In a business that thrived on youth and spectacle, Ferdy's elegant menace was slowly becoming passé. But the real collapse began in silence. In the privacy of his home, hidden from camera crews and autograph seekers, Ferdy began to forget. At first it was minor: names, faces, appointments. Then lines, scenes, entire memories. For an actor, whose craft is memory, this was more than aging, it was a tragedy. By the mid-1990s, Ferdy Mayne was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a cruel thief that slowly robs the body of its grace and the mind of its clarity. The man who had once played vampires and villains with perfect control could now barely hold a teacup steady. The voice that had seduced audiences across continents began to tremble. Even more painful was what lay beneath the disease: Alzheimer's. Slowly his past, his triumphs, his loves, his losses began to fade. The stories he had once lived and performed became shadows, unreachable. In a twist crueler than any role he had played, Ferdy Mayne was being erased from himself. He spent his final years in Brighton, England, under care, far from Hollywood's glittering lights. No scandal followed him, no tabloid frenzy, only silence and a handful of loyal friends who remembered the man behind the masks. On January 30th, 1998, Ferdy Mayne passed away at age 81. The official cause was complications from Parkinson's disease, though in truth it was a slow fading of mind, of memory, of the self. There were no dramatic last words, no spotlight. Only a quiet ending for a man whose life had once spanned continents, wars, and cinematic legends. His departure, like so much of his life, was dignified and heartbreakingly overlooked.
Ferdy Mayne was never a blockbuster name splashed across marquees. He didn't headline summer tent poles or command multi-million-dollar salaries. Yet, in a way that transcended stardom, his presence was unforgettable. haunting even. He represented a rare breed of actor, one who gave depth to the shadows, grace to the grotesque, and silence to suffering. By the time he passed in 1998, Ferdy had appeared in more than 230 film and television productions. From horror to comedy, war films to spy thrillers, he wove himself into the fabric of post-war European and American cinema, not as a face to idolize, but as a voice to remember. One could argue that his true gift wasn't fame, but atmosphere. He elevated every scene he touched, making the worlds around him richer, darker, more layered. His most iconic role as Count von Krolock in The Fearless Vampire Killers continues to captivate horror aficionados and cult cinema lovers alike. The performance remains a masterclass in restraint and charisma, not a caricature but a character, eerily seductive, profoundly melancholy. For many, it was the first time a vampire felt human. Beyond the screen, Ferdy's story resonated with those who knew it. A Jewish refugee who fled the Nazis, served the Allied cause, and reinvented himself in exile. In an age of reinvention, his was born not from vanity, but necessity. That quiet courage, that resilience veiled in charm, is a legacy as powerful as any role he played. He left behind no fortune worth tabloid mention, no scandalous memoir, no tell-all interviews. What he left instead was something rarer: dignity. In an industry that rewards noise, he remained still. In a world obsessed with self, he chose masks that reveal deeper truths. Today, younger actors may never know his name, but they know his archetype: the mysterious count, the sophisticated villain, the wounded exile. They are all echoes of Ferdy Mayne. And perhaps the most poignant tribute lies in the silence surrounding his death. No fanfare, no controversy. Just the quiet departure of a man who lived through war, played monsters, and never once stopped being a gentleman.
Ferdy Mayne may not have chased celebrity, but his presence lingers in the glow of black and white reels, in the quiet dread of a Gothic castle, in the knowing eyes of a man who had seen history's darkest hours. He was more than the roles he played. He was part of a generation who turned pain into performance, exile into elegance, silence into something meaningful. For those who remember The Fearless Vampire Killers, or caught a glimpse of him in Where Eagles Dare, or paused during a late-night broadcast of some forgotten thriller, Ferdy Mayne was always there, always watching, always layered in mystery. He belongs to a time when acting was art, when transformation was survival, and when dignity was louder than fame. If you've ever been haunted by a performance you couldn't explain, or moved by a man who seemed to carry more than the script allowed, perhaps you were watching Ferdy Mayne. And if his story touched you, even now, in this quiet remembrance, then his legacy remains intact. We invite you to share your thoughts, memories, or favorite moments of Ferdy below. Did you discover him through cult cinema, British TV, or perhaps by accident, the best way great performances are found? And if this tribute stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the forgotten faces who helped shape cinema's soul, consider subscribing to Whispered Glamour, because behind every spotlight, there's always a shadow worth remembering.